Hi, everyone. I'm Kimberly Boschman, and this is the Intentionally Intuitive podcast. In this episode, I wanted to get out a video that covers the compatibility of each life path number. And this is just going to be very high level, very quick, just to give you a general idea of how the two life paths or how each life path is sort of compatible with one another. We're going to talk about very briefly each, I'm going to say couple, but this can really pertain to friends, family, you name it. It doesn't just have to be romantic partners. But we're going to be looking at the strengths of that sort of union of those two life paths, as well as the weaknesses. And what I mean by weaknesses is simply the areas where there likely will be points of contention, where there likely will need to be greater conversation, and, where there needs to be probably some grace and understanding of each other. And so when we're talking about compatibility with numerology, and I would say the same is to be true for astrology, there are certain energies that work really well together and flow together really well, where there's not a lot of friction. There's not a lot of, again, points of contention. But then there's also energies that it is a little bit more difficult. It's kind of like, if you put fire and fire together, you're just going to get a big firestorm, which it can be great, can really work. There's a lot of strengths to that, but it can also be really highly combustible. There can be a lot of charged energy, and there can be those points of contention. It does not mean that where you have those difficulties or where you have that friction, and I would sort of equate it to like oppositions or squares in astrology, right? When you have two numbers, when they come together, there's that friction. It doesn't mean that you're not compatible or that you can't be compatible. If anything, it means when you can figure out how to work best with the strengths of each other and have the conversations and work together, you can actually really strengthen your connection and really become empowered in a lot of ways through that connection. So it's actually, sometimes the squares can be so powerful when it comes to strengthening connections, but you have to be able to show up to it in an emotionally mature way, ready to have the conversations, ready for the compromise, not sacrifice, compromise, and be willing to work it out and see it through. And a lot of times what we tend to see happening is where there's those points of contention or that friction, that's usually where the relationship tends to break down, and it becomes much more difficult to kind of see eye to eye or to stay together, so to speak. And that's why we would say they're incompatible. But the reality is that the two individuals determine whether or not that relationship will work. And the two individuals determine whether or not they are willing to do the work that is necessary to overcome those challenges. And really, when you have a compatibility reading or a synastry reading, that is really the goal, is to understand where there is that friction so that you can find the tools and figure out how to work through that friction, to calm it, to mitigate it, so that you can have a healthy connection and dynamic. A lot of times we look at compatibility and synastry in the world, and we say, oh, okay, well, if my numbers don't match, or if my synastry doesn't look good, or it's not a match with this person, then we're incompatible and I'm not interested. But we're kind of missing the point of compatibility and synastry. It's really to help to move through the growth and the evolution of those connections. It really, relationships are our greatest teachers. Those are the connections that help us to learn the most about ourselves, especially when there are, again, in astrology, squares and oppositions, or in numerology where there's, two numbers coming together, that there will definitely be points of contention to work through. And unless both parties are sort of highly evolved and in their higher expression of their energies all the time. So I want you to just use this as a very basic, very general tool just to gain a better understanding about, okay, so somebody with, if I'm friends with or a family member has, this particular number and I'm this number, this is potentially what could present, right? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses that could potentially present? And then it's up to you to decide, with that other person, how you will do the work to make it work, right? And that's why they say relationships take work. It's those points of contention or that friction that can absolutely be managed, that can absolutely be mitigated, but it takes work. And that's why we say relationships take work. So I hope that you'll find this to be a useful tool. Again, very high level, very basic, very quick, but it's just to kind of give you a taste of what to kind of look out for. Now, if you want to take a deep dive, because there's no way I could spend so much time talking about the compatibility for each life path number, but that's not really something I'm interested in doing for a video. So this is, again, just to kind of give you a taste, but if you are interested in diving much deeper into your synastry and your compatibility reports for numerology as well as astrology, then I do offer a service on my website that's Love Languages with Numerology. And again, it can be used for romantic couples, it can be used for family, friends, whatever. We can look at the synastry and the compatibility. And then you can gain a deeper understanding, again, where those points of contention might be. And some of them can be very difficult to overcome. And it will take a lot of growth and a lot of evolution and a lot of strength to overcome them. But it just depends on, is it worth it to you or not? And so we can help you to understand where those points of contention are. And it can help you to understand what is potentially needed in order to reach a more harmonious point within your connection based on those points of contention, right? And how to best work through them. So I do offer that on my website if that's something you're interested in diving deeper into. But for now, we're just going to kind of look at each life path number and the compatibility with the other life path numbers. Also keep in mind the points that I'm going to make today for each of these life path numbers are not all inclusive. Like there's so many things that can be said for each connection that we just don't have the time to do in this video. But again, you can definitely go much deeper with a personal reading. Also, timestamps will be available in the description box. All right, let's take a look. Life Path 4 with Life Path 4. So this is a really powerful connection. This can bring a lot of security, a sense of loyalty and commitment to the connection. 4s are typically solution focused and, again, very committed to whatever they sort of set their mind to. And so this would be a relationship that would tend to feel very secure, that you would feel very safe and secure within that connection. These tend to be people who are very structured and organized and sort of have a strong work ethic. And so, being in a connection with another 4, is a little bit easier because you understand how that person kind of moves through the world to some degree and what's important to them when it comes to, their values and their beliefs and such and so forth. However, anytime you have the same life path with the same life path, it does bring up points of contention because you're literally moving through similar storylines to each other. And so you're overcoming similar challenges. And though that can feel really good at times, can also be the thing that starts to create that point of contention. So 4s can be very stubborn, can be very fixed in their ways. And so you get these two sort of rams coming together, butting heads because of that stubbornness, can really draw a line in the sand and it's hard to kind of move beyond that. This would be a connection where if both are in their shadows or even one is in their shadow, they can be sabotaging of connections of themselves, of whatever it may be, to do with their self-limiting and self-sabotaging behavior. This is a connection where they struggle sometimes to move through or around their limitations. And so there can be a lot of projecting outwards and kind of blame and that sort of thing and not taking responsibility for their actions. holding a grudge, that sort of thing. Also, fours tend to be hyper independent, which again can work, well together if it's coming from a healthy place. But if it's not coming from a healthy place, then that hyper independence can kind of leave both people feeling a little bit isolated. Fours tend to be loyal to a fault. And so two fours together really wouldn't know when to call it when to call it quits, right? Or when to shift gears or move in a different direction. And then you put in that stubbornness, and that can be, again, a very limiting piece to the puzzle. Also with fours, it's a very emotional, intuitive energy. And so there's typically a lot of emotions to be managed and worked through and kind of honored. And if you're in your lower vibration of that, then you could have two individuals who tend to come across as aloof or unable to express themselves emotionally or unable to sort of manage those emotions. And that can come out in a myriad of ways, through arguments or outbursts or whatever, or just kind of shutting down and kind of holding it in. And that can create issues within the connection, of course. And so also the four tends to be, as it's moving through its shadows, very impatient. And so what they're meant to be moving towards in this lifetime is to become patient, have patience. And so you might, two people coming together who lack patience, that can create some fireworks at times. And not in the good way. And then also, again, fours tend to be very organized, very more traditional, more systematic, which is great. Again, however, when it comes into a connection, it can come across as my way or the highway, or I know best and not really looking at other perspectives. So two fours together, there can be a lot of the clashing of the heads, right? Like the butting of the heads, especially when it comes to working through things. And so, or doing things a certain way. So communication with two fours is going to be incredibly important. A life path 4 with life path 5. This can be a really beautiful dynamic because the 5 tends to be a little bit more scattered in its energy, a lot of moving parts, a lot of things going on. The 4 is more refined, it's more focused, it's more dedicated, and it can commit to something and see it through to completion, which the 5 can struggle with. The 4 is very independent. The 5 also is very independent or wants its independence and its freedom. And the 4 can give the 5 that without too much of a struggle. And the 4 can also bring that stability to the 5's life. Again, helping the 5 to focus, helping the 5 to commit to something and see it through to completion with the support of the 4. So it can be really powerful in that way. The 5 can help the 4 to become less rigid, less serious, enjoy life more, to experience life with all your senses and to think outside of their sort of comfort zone. And so it can be very freeing for the 4 to be in a connection with the 5. Again, the 5 helps the 4 to not take life so seriously and to let their hair down a little bit and to, find their joy and do things that they enjoy. So it can be a real blessing when these two come together. However, it can also bring points of contention because the 4 can be more serious, can be more, again, dedicated, and is really geared towards seeing things through to completion and getting to that final destination. The 5 wants the instant gratification, and if it doesn't see that instant gratification, it will tend to give up or sabotage too quickly. And that can be frustrating for the 4 who might not understand, like, why can't you just commit? Or why can't you just, pick this project up and finish it and get to the point of completion? What's the problem? And the 5 is like, don't put your rules on me. I want to be free. I want to I'm more unconventional and I want to just, fly by the seat of my pants. So there can be this point of contention of the 4 not getting the 5 and the 5 not getting the 4. And so communication, of course, is going to be really, really important. And also kind of recognizing where you need to kind of loosen your grip a little bit within that connection, because if the 4 is trying to control the 5 is going to run for the hills real quick. The 5 does not like necessarily those rules and regulations. It wants to be more progressive and more expansive and have that freedom. Whereas the 4 actually functions really well with organization and systems and, sort of a more logical approach. So without the communication, there can be a lot of misunderstandings between these two. And, it can be worked through, and it can actually prove to be quite a powerfully beautiful connection. But it's getting through those points of connection that are going to be probably the most difficult for the 4 and the 5. Once the 5 can sort of trust the 4 and feel safe within that environment, which the 4 can make that happen pretty quickly, then the 5 can overcome any kind of commitment issues or anything that they might have that feels like they're, being suffocated by a relationship or something like that. But the 4 has to be careful about not trying to control the 5 or trying to control the situation too much, and allowing the 5 to have its freedom and to have that unconventional life. Where there becomes that issue sometimes, again, if there's not that deeper communication, is the 5 is more conventional, or I'm sorry, the 4 is more conventional, the 5 is more unconventional. So you have like these two forces meeting that are kind of opposites. But it can work, and it can work really, really well. But it's going to take work and effort and communication. The 4 and the 6, this is a really beautiful connection because the 4 brings the security and that sense of security to the relationship and, that deeper commitment. And that's right up the 6's alley. The 6 wants to feel safe and secure within its connections, within its relationships, and the 4 can offer that. The 4 is a very loyal energy, and it's usually very very much into commitment, seeing things through to completion, moving through the challenges in a healthy way, and overcoming those challenges. There's a lot of wisdom tied to the 4, and the 6 can really thrive in that environment where they don't feel taken advantage of. They feel supported, so it can feel really, really beautiful. And the 6 brings a really strong level of nurturing to the 4. And the 4, is so sort of solution focused and usually work oriented and has a hard time sometimes working with their emotions. And the 6 can really, create that safe space for the 4 to feel supported and nurtured. And yeah, the 4 can really thrive in that environment just as the 6 can. So when they come together, it can be a very supportive, secure, nurturing connection. It can be really beautiful for both parties. Now, where there might be some points of contention is the 4 tends to be more independent to the point sometimes of hyper-independency. Also, the 4 can be very hyper-focused on work and reaching goals and that sort of thing, and it can kind of suffer a little bit when it comes to work and home life balance. And the 6 tends to be a little bit more of the homebody, someone who is more, their focus is the home and family and that environment. So, technically they could balance each other out really well. However, if the 4 is mostly focused on work and their achievements and their ambitions, and the 6 is more focused on home and family and that sort of thing, there at some point without that conversation, there's going to be that feeling of feeling unseen, and not, that they're not getting the attention that they need from both parties. The 4 can't understand why the 6 wants them to be home more or wants them to be whatever. And the 6 can't understand why the 4 is so focused on work or achievements or whatever. And again, remember, this is sort of a general forecast, so, it might present for you differently, but those are the typical energies. And so again, communication and finding that work and home life balance for both of those energies and coming together for what, in a way that works for both people will help that relationship to thrive. The other area is both the 4 and the 6 tend to be, can be in their lower vibration, a little bit of control freaks. And so, again, you get 2 people who can be stubborn and want to control the environment. To some degree, can wreak havoc on that connection. So it's really important that each person kind of feels seen and heard, and also sort of knows how to best show up in that connection so that it works for all involved. And that's going to come through communication, obviously. But overall, this is a really beautiful connection, can really, really work, and can really balance each other out in a beautiful way. But it's definitely going to take not feeling, again, because the 4 is more independent, whereas the 6 can be a little bit more thrive in interdependency. And so kind of finding that balance where the 6 feels heard and the 4 feels seen and heard can help that relationship. But otherwise, there could be that point of contention. There can kind of get to the point where the 4 feels a little suffocated by the 6, and the 6 feels like it's not getting the support that it needs. And so again, it's just that conversation and just recognizing each other's love languages and kind of working towards that. The 4 and the 7, this is actually a really powerful connection, especially when both are in their higher octave, because the 7 is typically very spiritual, very connected to the unseen, very much aware of its body, of its spirit, that sort of thing. So very intuitive. The 4 is also a very intuitive energy and very much heart-led. And so when these two come together, they can really help each other to trust their intuition, to follow that guidance, to open each other up to greater spiritual experiences. And it can really help the other part, each other. They can help each other to trust themselves and to follow that North Star that is themselves, right? Not lose themselves within the other person, but to follow that intuition, which can be really powerful. The other thing that's really beautiful here is the 7. This is a lifetime for trust, learning to trust self, others, and the universe throughout its journey. The 4 brings the stability. It brings the commitment and the loyalty and the seeing things through to completion and overcoming those challenges, with a steady hand, and really being the support and the strength that the 7 may need at times, because a lot of times with the 7, there can be a lot of shifts and changes, and there's a lot going on internally. And the 4 can help to bring that stability to the environment so that the environment isn't something that's also constantly changing. So it can be a really beautiful, supportive connection in that sense. Again, the 4 sort of bringing the stability, the 7 bringing the spirituality, and also the 7 allowing the 4 to feel confident in that side of themselves. Because a lot of times the 4 can be very sort of factual and logically driven, and that can feed into that side of the 7 as well. But the 7 also has such a strong and profound connection to the unseen that it really can open those doors for the 4, which the 4 also, again, is very intuitive and very much, there's a extreme depth to the 4 that a lot of times the 4 doesn't feel comfortable expressing, but the 7 can help them to do that, which can be really beautiful. And you get this into a connection and what the 2 of these people could build and create using all sides of themselves, not only the logical, but also the spiritual, not only the physical, but the spiritual as well, can be very profound, very profound. And again, because the 7, this is a lifetime for learning to trust, and that 4 comes in with, giving them every reason that you can trust, it really helps the 7 along that journey. And that can be really, really powerful and beautiful. Also, both tend to be more independent. The 4 is sometimes hyper independent. The 7, this is a lifetime of greater self-discovery. So there's a lot of internal, needing your alone time, needing that time for solitude. And the 4 is someone who typically would be okay with that, would not feel like they're being neglected because the 7 needs time alone or whatever. Because again, the 4 tends to be more hyper independent as well. And so these two coming together would give each other the space that they need and be able to communicate that and, create that healthy environment. Where there could be some points of contention would be, especially with the emotional side of things, because the 7 is an emotion. I mean, we all are, but the 7 is meant to kind of work with their emotions in this lifetime and manage those and really get to that point of emotional maturity. And same thing with the 4. The 4 can suppress emotions, suppress feelings, that sort of thing, and just kind of focus on the more, the goal at hand. And so if you get 2 people who are in their shadows, then there can be a lot of fighting, a lot of just mismanaged emotions, and kind of projecting that outwards and not having the healthy communication, not having the conversations, not being vulnerable with one another, that sort of thing, but more the reactivity. And obviously that can drive a wedge within that connection. So, but if you get two individuals who are in their higher octave of the 4 and the 7, beautiful connection, very, very powerful, very, very powerful in a lot of ways. But definitely kind of working through those emotions, also recognizing limitations and moving through those limitations and insecurities. Both the 4 and the 7 are kind of coming to the table with a bag of insecurities, especially early on. And so, if you're not working with those insecurities in a healthy way, they're going to be projected outwards and looking for the other person to heal them. And that just creates that greater wedge. And I would also say too, as like kind of a closing point to these two, is both can hold a grudge like nobody's business when they're in their shadow. So, it's very much is going to be really important that the conversation happens in the communication, because otherwise a lot of sort of, grudge holding and vindictiveness and that sort of thing can kind of stem. So, in their lower sort of shadow, this can be a volatile connection, to be honest. But when it's in their higher octaves, beautiful, beautiful connection. The 4 and the 8, this is a very much powerhouse connection. This again would be one of those status couples, power couples that, or, connection. Excellent for a business connection relationship. So if you're entering into some kind of business partnership, if it's a 4 and an 8, what you all could build, astronomical. Just massive. So the 4 and the 8 are part of what we call the manifesting triad. And so these two work together really, really well, because the 4 brings the stability. It brings the sort of the plan and the protocol for making the 8's vision come true. And it doesn't necessarily just have to be the 8's vision. It can be the 4's as well. But the 8 is really good about, being the expert, sharing that expertise, having the vision, moving towards that vision in a using resources to achieve that vision, and the networking, the whatever it takes to make the vision come true. And the 4 is really good about the protocol, the systems, the planning, the step-by-step to make it happen. And the 4 is phenomenal at commitment. And so committing to seeing it through to completion, where the 8 might be like, okay, this is too difficult, let's give up. The 4 is like, no, we're going to get that summit and we're going to keep going. And so when it comes to ambitions and again, achievements and that sort of thing, these two, there's what they can do together is the possibilities are endless. Very, very powerful connection. Again, the 4 brings the stability, where the 8, a lot of the 8's journey is a lot of taking risks and highs and lows and gains and losses. So there's a lot of fluctuations. There's a lot of shifts within the 8's journey. And that can create a lot of insecurities. It can create a lot of fear around taking risks, that sort of thing. But the 4 brings that stability. It brings that sense of foundation. So it kind of gives the 8 the grounding that it needs and the sense of security that it needs in order to take those risks that it needs to take on its journey. And these are both also very ambitious energies. They can also tend to be more independent, right? So that you get two independent people coming together with their own ideas and their own vision and their own, again, ambition. And these two kind of being each other's greatest cheerleaders can really, again, just create this dynamic where so much can be accomplished. So much can be accomplished. Also, both the 4 and the 8 struggle with self-doubt and feelings of, like imposter syndrome and that sort of thing that come through. And they can really help each other through those periods where, again, the 8 is lacking confidence or the 4 has self-doubt. They can really help each other through that if they're both in their higher octave. Now, if they're in their lower octaves, this can be a really challenging connection because the 4 likes to have control of its environment. The 8 likes to have control of its environment. And so both can kind of come across as sort of needing that sense of dominance almost, or control over the environment. And that, of course, can can bring in the stubbornness. And there's a lot of stubbornness with 4 and 8 energy. So it's kind of like if you're in a headlock with a 4 and an 8, that can be a headlock that can last for years. So also holding a grudge. 4 and 8s are phenomenal at holding grudges. So you have to be able to have the conversations, work through it, figure out the other person's love language and make it happen. But both can be very competitive as well. And so if you let that kind of enter into your relationship, that can wreak havoc as well and create that point of contention. The 4 can end up, getting frustrated by the 8 and sabotaging that connection. The 8 can get frustrated with the 4 always wanting control because the 8 wants control and, getting frustrated with that situation or that connection. And so these are 2 sort of more dominant energies that tend to that come through. And so it would really be about finding that balance where, sometimes the 4 takes the lead, sometimes the 8 takes the lead, but being able to sort of give up that control when it's needed. Also, again, when we're in our lower vibrations, the 4 could see the 8's risk-taking behavior as too risky, really, like too flamboyant, too not structured enough, and it can frighten the 4. And so because the 4 likes structure, it likes organization, it likes commitment, it likes knowing, his I's dotted and his T's crossed. And the 8 might be like, hey, this opportunity came in, I'm going to go for it, but it's high risk, and that can make the 4 nervous. And so again, it just comes back to conversation. So where in the long run, and when both are in their higher octaves, it can be an incredibly powerhouse dynamic. In its lower octave, the things that make it so special in its higher octave become the points of contention. And so the 4 has to find a way to let the 8 take its risks, do its thing, because that's the journey the 8's on. And the 8 has to be okay with the 4 being a little bit more level-headed, more like cautious, more calculated, right? And using those characteristics of each for their benefit as opposed to the unraveling of the connection. And the other thing I would say about the points of contention, again, when we're in our lower vibrations, both of these individuals have to find ways to work through their limits, right? Either work with them or whatnot. If not, then the insecurities can pop up, and those insecurities can be projected out to the other person to sort of take care of. But really what that does is create that wedge within that connection. And so both the 4 and the 8 have to move through their own self-doubt, their limitations, and not see it as failure and not project that outwards and face their insecurities, basically. Because if not, it could be the downfall of that connection. But when they can work together, then unstoppable. The 4 and the 9 can be a really beautiful connection. This is one where the 9 would bring compassion and understanding to the connection and allow the 4 to be more vulnerable and to really kind of go deeper into its softer side, which sometimes the 4 has a hard time doing. The 4 can be more sort of focused on, be more ambitious and focused on, achievement in this lifetime. And the 9 helps the 4 to sort of sit with its softer side and get connected with its softer side. And the 4 helps the 9 to sort of recognize, where it needs to have healthier boundaries or greater standards and not, allow itself to get taken advantage of, that sort of thing, and speak up for themselves, be their own best advocate, that sort of thing. So the 4 can bring a greater sense of security and a solid foundation into the life of the 9. Whereas a lot of times the 9 can feel like there's a lot of moving parts in this journey. There's a lot of shifts and a lot of, just people falling away or things, working against them and that sort of thing. And the 4 can really bring in that solid sense of security that helps the 9 to feel more stable. So there's this really beautiful exchange that can happen within this connection that can be really beautiful, long term. However, there are definitely some points of contention where, the 9 tends to be more like wear their heart on their sleeve, right? More emotional, more sensitive, so to speak, and might need more sort of attention or nurturing. And the 4 tends to be more hyper independent and more, again, like focused on ambitions and their goals in this lifetime. And so the 9 can end up feeling misunderstood or not appreciated or not, because the 4 can struggle with expressing their emotions. That can sometimes come across as like aloof, although the 4 is very deeply emotive and also very intuitive. There's a very strong side, spiritual side to the 4, but it's when you're with a 4 who is in their higher octave that you would experience that, right? And so again, in the higher octave, the 4 and the 9 complement each other really, really well. But in the lower octaves, again, the 4 can come across as aloof and not really present for the connection enough to meet the needs of the 9. And for the 4, the 9 can come across as almost like too needy, too clingy, that sort of thing. And so it can kind of put a damper on things. Also, the 4 can be stubborn. The 4 can be very stubborn. The 9 can too, but the 4 can be stubborn. And so it could be a dynamic where the 4 tends to get its way, and the 9 starts to feel like they're sacrificing to some degree. And for the 4, they might feel like the 9 is in victim mode too much or is too cynical or et cetera, and not understanding the journey of the 9. So again, it just becomes this process of conversation and understanding each other's love languages and what you need, and finding the balance between that. And when you can get to that place in the 4 and the 9, again, beautiful connection here. But otherwise, it can be a challenge. It can definitely be some challenges there. But also, I will say, on a beautiful note, the 4 is a very loyal, committed energy. And the 9 is used to sort of people being disloyal or people falling away or people taking advantage, that sort of thing. So a 4 and a 9, the 4 again can bring that sense of security, that feeling of, okay, I can be me, I can like breathe, I can let my hair down, and there's that strong sense of loyalty and commitment there. So the 9 can relax a little bit within that relationship, and that can be really beautiful. And again, the 9 helps the 4 to soften up a little bit, not take life so seriously. So it can be beautiful. And that's another point of contention I would also say, though, is the 9 can be more, and its lower vibration can be more cynical, serious, and the 4 can go, become very serious very quickly. And, too much of that creates this pessimistic, cynical connection. And so that can be detrimental as well. But overall, really beautiful connection if you can get there. The 5 and the 5, this would be a really interesting dynamic. I would really love to hear if anybody's a 5 who's with a 5 or has some kind of deeper connection with a 5. The reason why I say that is because, 5s tend to be more commitment phobes. They tend to be, want their freedom, their independence. They're, they're more unconventional. They don't necessarily fall into or like the rules that are often in place. And so 2 5s coming together could be really interesting. It could be really beautiful because it would be if you meet a 5 who's in their higher octave, then these are 2 people who understand that need for freedom, that need to not be restricted or, being able to express themselves fully without worrying about being shamed or, ridiculed or whatever. And so if you get 2 5s together who are in their higher octave, it can be a very fun, freeing, adventurous, just extraordinary time. I think it would be a lot of fun. But the points of contention with 2 5s coming together is 5s typically, they want that instant gratification. And so a lot of times they are those commitment phobes because they're afraid of things becoming too mundane, too stagnant, etc. And so they can often self-sabotage when things become too mundane, too repetitive. So if you get 2 5s together, it's constantly making sure that you're keeping the relationship alive and spicy and all the things, and still being able to work through those periods of, obligations and when things become routine and mundane as life happens. So I think the biggest point of contention here, or the biggest issue that 2 5s would face, is seeing that relationship or that connection through, continue with it, to continue on with it and not give up too quickly because things become too routine. The other thing is, 5s tend to be, again, just very scattered in their energy a lot of times, which isn't a bad thing. There's just a lot of energy moving through them, and that can be creative or whatever. And they tend to pick up projects and put them down, pick them up, put them down. And it's hard for them to focus their energy and then again, commit, see it through to completion. So if you get 2 5s together, it can create a tremendous amount of chaos within that dynamic because you have two people who have a hard time not only focusing, but focusing their energy on something for long term. But because, again, they typically are used to a lot of change and transformation and evolution and growth and movement, right? Progressiveness. So it could, that could be the downfall of the connection, just as it could be the beautiful side of the connection. But again, it would just have to be worked through. I think 2 5s together would really have to work at the details of that connection, figuring out the long-term plan and how to stick to it when things become too routine, or how to spice things up when things become too routine within that connection. Because out of all of the numbers, the 5s can get the itchy feet quicker than anyone, wanting to move on to the next one or the next thing. So it can definitely create some chaos there with that difficulty to commit long-term. And that just ties into the free spiritedness of of them. The other thing is they can be sort of each other's own worst enemy, so to speak. And the reason why I say that is because 5s tend to move in extremes. And so, either the extreme restriction or the extreme excessiveness. And so if you have two people who are in their lower octave, they're probably moving in extremes. And so this can bring in addictions. This can bring in living in excess. This can be living beyond your means. This can be overly restricted to the point where you're controlling you and your environment so much that you're actually, it's toxic. And so in the lower vibrations, it can be really detrimental, actually. In the higher octaves, it can be incredibly beautiful because you can be working with each other to do things in moderation, to, help balance each other out. So yeah, it's just kind of making sure that if you are in extremes, you recognize it and you're able to manage that and have the conversations, but it could get out of hand and out of control very quickly with 2 5s coming together. But again, if you can manage it, if you can get to that point of both being in that higher octave, yeah, it can be a really freeing, beautiful, supportive, high energy connection. The 5 and the 6, again, can be a really beautiful connection. The 5 brings in that need for freedom, that freedom seeking and adventure, right? And the 6 brings in the nurturing and the care and the support and, that sort of grounding energy that the 5 can definitely use at times. Where there can be some points of contention within this connection would be, the 6 is more, it's more like, I always say the homebody, right? It's very much focused on home and relationships and connections and that sort of thing, and more focused on the home environment a lot of times. And it usually likes long-term commitments, that sort of thing. The 5 is a much more wild child type of energy. It wants its freedom. It doesn't want to be tied down. It wants, unconventionality. And the 6 can be more conventional in its approach. And so when these two come together, if they're not in their higher octave or they don't have good communication, then, the 6 is looking for that stable, kind of more quiet, more solid home environment. And the 5 is looking to go on the adventures and try new things and, again, not be tied down. The 5 out of all the numbers is the commitment phobe. They tend to, again, be very independent and not want to fall in line with the rules that are usually in place when it comes to relationships or society or whatever. And so that can definitely create a point of contention, right? The 6 wants commitment and stability, and the 5 wants freedom and adventure, And so finding a six that can be secure within that connection and trust their partner, if they're a five, is what would make that connection work well, right? Because the five is once it starts to feel like it's being pinned down, it will probably try to sabotage that connection and fall away. But if the six is trusting and again, like in its higher octave, then it's not going to have to sort of keep tabs on the five to make sure that the five stays in line. So it does take emotionally mature individuals, I think, for the five and the six to come together and for it to work really well, just because of the energy dynamics there. But it can absolutely be done. And when it is done and done well, it can be a very beautiful connection. But the six would have to, again, be very trusting of the five and give that five its freedom without worrying too much. And a lot of times the six likes to control the environment to make sure everything's okay and everyone is good. And the five's off bungee jumping off a cliff somewhere. You know what I mean? So it's really hard to kind of control that environment. And the five could see the six as too clingy, too controlling, that sort of thing. And so again, conversation, learning the love languages, working with each other, and, meeting each other in the middle is what would help this connection thrive. Otherwise, I think it's one of the more difficult connections, to be honest, but can absolutely work if you work at it. The 5 and the 7, this is an interesting dynamic. It can be beautiful when when they come together. The 7, or I'm sorry, the 5 can open the 7 up to trying new things, being more adventurous, getting out of its mind and into, its body and experiencing things to extreme sometimes. But it can definitely get the 7 out of its comfort zone and, again, open it up to experiencing life with all of its senses, which can be really good for the 7, because this is a lifetime for 7s about, going within and greater self-discovery. And it can be a very deep kind of transformative lifetime. And the 5 is about, that freedom and expression and adventure and curiosity and experiencing life with all your senses and all those things. And so it can really open the 7 up to not being so serious or not so in the mind and more experiencing life, which can be really powerful in a lot of ways. And the 7 can really open the 5 up to that greater self-discovery, really getting very present and standing still for a moment to learn more about itself, right? And kind of the 7 can open the 5 up to greater spirituality and a deeper understanding of themselves, which can be really beautiful for a 5, because a lot of times 5 is so in the future, it's such a fast moving energy. So it can work really beautifully in its higher octaves for sure. Now, where there's some points of contention, and these are significant, the 7, this is a lifetime of learning to trust, right? So trusting self, trusting others, trusting the universe. And because of that sort of lesson plan that's laid out for the 7, when it's in a connection where it doesn't feel, I don't want to say safe, but where it doesn't feel like it can trust its partner, or, it's just doesn't feel as solid, that can definitely sort of touch those wounds, right? Or create those lessons. And the 5 is someone who absolutely needs its freedom. It's typically more unconventional in its approach. It needs to be able to express itself fully, not be confined by the rules that are typically in place. It needs to be able to do its own thing. And when things become too serious or too sort of mundane or routine, or it starts to feel it's like it's being tied down, it can sabotage that connection and want to break free. And the 7 might need someone in their life that is a little bit more, I don't want to say stable, but, is probably more like 4 energy, where it's more solid and not as fast moving, right? And the 5, again, is just it's all about change and transformation and movement. And so that could create a very significant sort of rupture within the connection. The 5 needs its space. The 5 is, again, unconventional. Like a lot of 5s are more about are more polyamorous or want open relationships or are okay with doing things differently. And the 7 can be a little bit more traditional in nature and can be a little bit more needing more, I guess, calm, where the 5 is disruptive by nature. The 5 energy is disruptive by nature, so it can bring some chaos. So again, just needing that freedom. And the 7 needs a little bit more solid commitment to be able to trust and that sort of thing. So again, it's very doable, but it would take a lot of trust by the 7 for the 5, and it would take the 5 understanding that they might need to tone it down a little bit or slow down a little bit, So it's just finding that compromise, especially when it comes to commitment. So, there's just a lot to kind of unpack there, but that can definitely be the biggest point of contention. And if you can get through that, then yes, beautiful connection. But sometimes that's really difficult to kind of move through because it's just such significant different love languages. For the 5 and the 9, this is, again, interesting connection. Not saying it can't work. It can absolutely work, especially when both are in their higher octaves. In the higher octave, this is the 5 is the freedom seeker. So it's going to open the 9 up to not taking life so serious, to, experiencing life, to bring the focus back to self a little bit and, to, again, experience life, to try new things, to step outside of their comfort zone, etc. And the 9 can help the 5 to get more focused, to focus their energy into things that are beyond themselves, right? Stepping into a purpose greater than self, and bringing that compassion and infusing the compassion into the connection. And again, the 5 tends to be more independent. The 9 tends to be more interdependent, like wanting to connect with others, work with others, etc. Especially in a relationship, the 9 would be more wanting to a solid commitment, marriage, that sort of thing. Where the 5 is typically more of the commitment phobe, and when things feel too restrictive or feel too much like they're being tied down, then they can sabotage that connection and try to break free from it. So it can work well with the 5 and the 9, but there definitely would be some points of contention. And again, it would be the 9 would have to be able to loosen up a little bit and allow the 5 to be its unconventional self and not try to control the 5, not try to judge the 5 for, again, its very unconventional ways. And the 5 with the 9 would have to kind of maybe compromise a little bit when it comes to what commitment looks like, what the two agree on, and finding a way to be okay with that. And so, the biggest point of contention, I think, would be, again, the 9 tends to be a little bit more serious, tends to be a little bit more needing that, a very controlled, very, by controlled, I just mean not a lot of chaos within a connection, and that sense of solid security. And the 5 by nature is disruptive. It's meant to change and sort of break the rules, and that can make the 9 uncomfortable. And so it is sort of like opposites attracting here, to be honest. But it can, again, the 5 can open the 9 up. It can kind of bring it outside of its comfort zone and open its eyes to new perspectives and trying new things. But that can make the 9 uncomfortable to almost an extreme, just because, again, so much of the 9's life is transient. There's a lot of movement and transformation throughout the 9's life as well. And so where it can seek stability, it tends to, and in a relationship, for sure. So, and the 5 needs that sense of adventure and spontaneity and freedom. And so there can definitely be, I think this is a point of contention that can be really incredibly difficult to overcome. Not saying that it can't happen, because it absolutely can. But it is one of the more difficult connections, I think, for the most part. For the 5 and the 8, So this would be a really beautiful connection, really powerful as well, because the 8 is a risk-taking type of energy. It is meant to take risks in this lifetime. That's part of the journey. And there's a lot of highs and lows with that, but there's this constant need to take risks and put yourself out there and think outside the box and do things outside the box and be a little bit more unconventional in your approach. And the 5 is master at that. Like the 5 is all about, when it's in its higher octave, especially greater freedom of expression, trying new things, being adventurous, being curious, exploring, change, taking risks. And so these two energies coming together can really cheer each other on really, really well. Like it's natural for the 5 to want to try new things and to pursue different outlets and just experience life, right? And the 8 sometimes needs a little bit of motivation or a kick in the butt to take the risk. And the reason for that is because with taking risks, a lot of times those risks don't work out and we get burned, so to speak. And so there's a lot of valleys that you have to move through. And that can kind of dampen your spirit when it comes to taking another risk because you're afraid it's not going to work out. But the 5 can bring the energy to that dynamic to really motivate the 8 to try again, pick yourself up and try again. What's the problem? Let's go. Let's try something new. It's a lot more spontaneous. So it can be really powerful in that sense and really help to, again, motivate the 8 and help the 8 to find that confidence to try again and to not be so hard on themselves when things don't go as planned. Because a lot of times with 5 energy, if things don't go as planned, they just shift gears and move into the next direction and on to the next thing. And so it's very fluid, and that can be really beneficial for the 8. So again, a business connection with the 5 and the 8, I think would be really good. Like it could be really powerful. Now, the issue, or that maybe the point of contention here would be the 5 tends to be when it's sort of in its lower octave, moving from a place of extremes. So it can either be extremely rigid and restrictive, or it can be extremely in excess, right? Like moving in excess, living beyond its means, taking too many risks, being too spontaneous. And the 5 is meant to be moving more from its center, right? Like a place of moderation. And the 8, who's meant to take a lot of risks in this lifetime, could feel easily influenced by the impulsivity of the 5 and start to take risks that are more impulsive and not, calculated or well thought through. And that can lead to more valleys, right? And so then that can kind of have the opposite effect. And the 5 sort of, obviously being in those extremes can be toxic as well. So that can sometimes be a point of contention between the 5 and the 8, just that feeding into each other's impulsivity and kind of those extremes. And that can definitely wreak havoc on not only the relationship, but your circumstances as well, especially if it comes to, overspending or whatever the case may be, or overindulging, right? Like addictions come into play a lot with 5s when they're in their lower vibration, especially when they're moving impulsively and kind of feeding into those extremes. So that can affect the relationship too, of course. Both of these energies tend to be more independent. And that feeds both really, really well. So that's actually a beautiful aspect of this connection, where they can kind of tend to give each other their own space and their own freedom to do what they want to do, which can really be beneficial. The only thing is also with the 8, the 8 can tend to be controlling. It's just a characteristic of the 8 that it has to figure out and move through and, figure out what works and what doesn't work when it comes to that. And the 5 will sabotage a connection quicker than anything, quicker than a lightning bolt if they feel too controlled or restricted or tied down in some way. So, if it's a situation where the 8 is trying to control the 5 in some way, or control aspects of the 5, or dominate the 5 in some way, that's going to be a huge point of contention. And you'll likely see that there will be some sabotaging there from the 5. The 5 wants to break free and will feel claustrophobic and need to get away. So that can definitely be a point of contention that the 8 needs to be careful about, is not trying to have control over the other person or the dynamic, and or try to easily influence the other person in some way. But when these two come together and they can be there, they can be autonomous and they can be independent, it actually can thrive really, really, really well. Life path 6 with life path 6. So this could be a really beautiful connection, but it could also have some significant points of contention. Anytime we have two life paths the same that are coming together in some way, especially as romantic relationships, it can be challenging because you're basically moving through similar storylines, and that seems like it would be helpful, and it can be, but sometimes that can actually just kind of add to the layers of kind of lessons you have to move through, and it can be a little bit challenging. So in the higher octave, if both people are in the higher octave of the 6, it can be an incredibly nurturing energy. You basically have two givers coming together, wanting to give to one another. And so it can be a very caring, very nurturing environment, very supportive environment for both parties. Both tend to be more sort of focused on their relationships, on their home environment, creating sort of a beautiful, safe space for those, connections and for their home space. So it can just be a really soft and cozy and comfortable connection. Before I go into the points of contention, I'll also mention that 6s tend to be very creative and, are very good at, again, beautifying a space and, sharing their creativity to beautify a space. And so you get two creatives coming together, and what you can create would be very beautiful. So it's a very loving, supportive, creative, justice-oriented relationship, or tends to be when they're both in their higher octave. Now, in their lower octave, if both are in their lower octave, then you can see, they're still kind of in that mode of perfectionism, needing control of their environment. And sometimes that bleeds into trying to control the other person. Again, just because they want to make sure that everyone's good and everybody's safe and everything's taken care of. And they can kind of step into that martyrdom role. And so you get two martyrs that come together, and that can create some havoc within the relationship. Also, in their lower octave, they can tend to be self-righteous, kind of overbearing and meddling or demeaning. And so again, two people coming together who are, trying to control the dynamic really, or control the other person, or meddling in other people in the other person's affairs and not trusting or giving them space or autonomy, can create a lot of issues, of course. And it just kind of stems back to that overprotectiveness that can kind of drive the 6, especially when they're in their lower energy, can kind of be more fear-based driven. And so, again, two people coming together in that sort of lower energy can be a lot. And so, it's one of the more difficult, I think, connections to move through until you get to the other side and you get to the higher octaves. Then it becomes this just beautiful oasis of a connection. And so again, communication, understanding, having those conversations goes a really long way. The 6 and the 7. So this connection, again, in their higher octaves can be really beautiful. The 6 can bring a lot of support and nurturing and care into the 7's life. And that can be really stabilizing for the 7, because the 7 in this lifetime is really going through so much internal. There's a lot of internal, I don't want to say chaos, but a lot to work through, a lot with self-discovery and kind of going within and moving through a lot. And so the 6 can bring, again, that sense of stability and calm and just nurturing energy to really create that safe space for the 7. And the 7 can help the 6 to open up to their spirituality, to their higher self, to, come back to themselves in order to recognize their worth and their value, and to be able to learn to have higher standards and to stand up for themselves and to sort of demand that equal exchange of energy or reciprocity. So it becomes, where the 6 is always focused on everybody else for the most part, the 7 can help the 6 to come back to themselves, to get aligned and get acquainted with themselves. And that can do wonders when it comes to the 6, again, having those higher standards and saying no and following through with that. So it can be incredibly beautiful in that sense. And again, the 7 helps the 6 to take more time for self, and that can be incredibly beautiful. Now, where this can kind of create some points of contention would be, in the lower, in the shadow side of the 6, we have a lot of martyrdom, overprotectiveness, high expectations, kind of manipulation can come in at times, victim mentality, and they kind of can move from more fear-based until they, again, kind of learn the lessons of the life path and step into the higher octave. Also perfectionism. And so that can kind of bleed into the relationship with the 7, high expectations, perfectionism, expecting their partner to be perfect. Again, trying to manipulate the situation or be the martyr or try to save their partner, or try to do everything for their partner. And that can be incredibly suffocating and frustrating for the 7. For the 7, this is a lifetime also of learning to trusting self, trusting others, etc. And so, again, in their lower octave, they can be very mistrustful of their partner. And, that can be very frustrating for the 6 because typically the 6 is a very loyal partner for the most part, right? Genuinely speaking. And so to have to kind of move through those trust issues can be very daunting for the 6 and very frustrating and can make the 6 feel unseen and unheard. Another piece of this is both are more, I don't want to say reclusive, but the 6 tends to be more of a homebody. The 7 tends to be more of a hermit at times and kind of, needs that that solitude. And these two together, if they're not careful, could kind of become very reclusive and kind of miss out on sort of integrating into the world type of thing and kind of go into their cave and never leave, which sounds wonderful, but, that can be detrimental and kind of turn into toxicity down the road. The other piece of this is that the 6 tends to be very focused on its relationships, wants that companionship and that closeness and that connectivity. And not saying that the 7 doesn't, but the 7 really does need ample times for solitude and being able to have that sense of autonomy. And if there's not the communication, then, the 7 might feel a little suffocated by the 6 and the 6 might feel unseen and unheard by the 7. So again, communication, learning each other's love languages, regardless of what kind of relationship it is going to be important. The 6 and the 8. So this can be a really beautiful connection when the 2 are in their higher octave, of course, because, the 8 is a very ambitious, very driven, very it's a journey of needing to take a lot of risks and a lot of ups and downs, a lot of gains, a lot of losses. And, that can affect the 8's confidence and sense of security and all of those things. And then the 6 is, the core of the 6 energy is about love and nurturing and support and, beautifying a space and providing comfort. So the 2 coming together can be this beautiful exchange of give and take and reciprocity where each are benefiting in some way. The 8 can help the 6 to step into their power, to become empowered, to focus on self a little bit more when it comes to achieving their goals, and kind of complement the 6's sort of journey of assisting and supporting others. And the 6, again, can offer the support and the security and the nurturing for the 8. So it becomes this beautiful interplay between the 2 when they're in their higher octave. Now, when they're in their lower octaves, Again, the same things can be said and they can kind of work against the connection. So the 6 can come across to the 8 as being very clingy, as sort of wanting to do everything for the 8 or really kind of control the dynamic of how the 8 is showing up. It might show, because sometimes the 6 can be driven by fear. Can be more fear-based. And so, the 8 needs to take risks in this lifetime. So if their partner or the connection, the friend or whatever, is saying, oh no, or is overly cautious and saying, oh no, don't try that, don't do that, too much is at stake, it can kind of hold the 8 back and keep the 8 from moving on its path of what it's destined to do, right? Which is take those risks and build that, let's just say, empire, right? And so it really needs a partner or a friend or a connection that is going to be supportive in that and not try to hold them back out of fear of what could happen. And the intention of the 6 may be good, right? It wants to protect the 8, but it can come across as, or it can kind of have the opposite effect where it holds the 8 back, and that can be really detrimental to the journey of the 8. Also, the 8 tends to want control of its environment for the most part, and so does the 6. Both tend to be perfectionists in a lot of ways, and so two perfectionists coming together that both want control, there can be that butting of heads. And the 6 can sometimes fall into victim mentality, and so the 8 can sometimes be more direct and more blunt, so to speak. It's more goal oriented, I guess, in a lot of ways, and so it's more ambitious in a lot of ways. And so the 6 might fall into victim mode within that connection, and that can be frustrating for both the 6 and the 8. So again, it's just learning the love languages of each and having that communication and the conversation. But there is definitely a lot of opportunity for miscommunication, hurt feelings where there doesn't really need to be any. It's just learning to allow each party to be, autonomous and independent, and also be interdependent, work together. Also, in the lower octave, both can be manipulative and dishonest and kind of have high expectations of their partner and try to, again, control or change their partner in some way. And obviously that can be very detrimental to the connection. And so it's just about, two healthy 6 and 8s coming together can be incredibly beautiful. 2 6s and 8s coming together that are in their shadows can turn toxic actually pretty quickly. There can be a lot of power plays, a lot of manipulation within the connection. And so it's, again, getting to that place of having the conversations, working together, and learning each other's love languages for the most part. With the 6 and the 9, this can be an incredibly loving connection, very supportive, very compassionate. The 9 is the humanitarian, the 6 is the nurturing caregiver. And so these two coming together can be very supportive and very compassionate with one another, creating a space where both people feel seen and heard and supported. So it can be a very loving connection, basically two givers coming together and making sure that each other feels seen and heard and supported. So it can be incredibly beautiful. And also, the 6 can open the 9 up to connecting with others, which is a really big part of the journey of the 9. But the 6 can connect people, connect the 9 to their greater community, open the doors for them, so to speak. Sometimes the 9 can, because of the journey that the 9 is on, can become a little bit more reclusive or sort of shut in and cut off from the world. And the 6 can kind of help them to continuously open their heart and be vulnerable and, seek that connection from the outside world. So it can be really beautiful in that sense. And the 9 can help the 6 open up to their spirituality, their sense of self, their, taking care of themselves, and as well as finding greater outlets for their gifts, right? And their nurturing and their loving and all those things. So just as the 6 can help the 9 come back into the community, get reacquainted with others and integrate to some degree, the 9 can also do that for the 6. The 6 tends to be a little bit more of a homebody, and so can be a little bit more reclusive at times. And the 9 can help the 6 to get out into the community. So it just kind of depends on the dynamic. But they definitely can work really, really well together. This is a really beautiful connection when they're both in their higher octave. When they're in their lower octaves, though, the 6 can be manipulative, fall into victim mentality, need to have control, and kind of can come across as a martyr at times. They can hover, they can be overly protective, they can be those perfectionists with overly high expectations, and then become resentful when those expectations aren't met. And so they can also be very have a hard time sort of asking for help and support, as well as have a hard time setting healthy standards. And the same exact sort of characteristics can be said for the 9 when it's in its lower octave. It can become very cynical, very, again, martyrdom, perfectionist, manipulative, victim mentality. And so if you get these 2 together and they're in their lower octave, it can be quite toxic, actually, until the work is done and the conversations are had and you work together to obviously step into the higher octaves and gain a greater sense of self and self-love and all those things. But, it can be beautiful to work through that together, but it can be very difficult. Because a lot of times when you're in sort of victim mentality, or you're more fear-based, or you're more cynical or whatever, it helps to have a partner or a friend who is more solid and able to pull you out of that, right? Or help you pull you out of that, or offer a different perspective or or a dose of reality, right? So again, these 2 would just need to be careful about not sucking each other into their own shadow sides. But yeah, because they both share pretty much the same characteristics in that sense. But once they overcome that and they step into their higher octaves, beautiful, beautiful supportive connection. And it is possible to get there with that open communication and that work, but it will take some work. Okay, the 7 and the 7, it's interesting because out of all the numbers, because I think that 2 numbers coming together that are the same are probably the more difficult relationships to have. Except for the 7 and the 7, there are definitely points of contention. We'll talk about that. But the 7 and the 7 coming together, I feel like actually works really, really well. And the reason for that is because, this journey for the 7 is really about self-discovery. It's really about coming back to self. It's a very much a lifetime very much focused on self. And sort of working through the deeper workings of the psyche, the mind, what they're feeling, their emotions, all of those things. So it's a very, again, I don't want to say self-centric lifetime, but it's definitely one where they need that time for solitude. They have to take time to, sort of decompress, self-soothe, but also, self-reflect. And so it's interesting to me because if you have 2 7s coming together, they kind of can respect that about each other, no matter whether they're in their shadow side or if they're in their, higher octave. Like, this is one of those scenarios where 2 life paths coming together that are the same can really actually support each other through that deeper understanding of understanding what the other person needs. And so that can be really, really beautiful. And also they can help the other person to see things about themselves that they wouldn't see otherwise. They all essentially become sort of a mirror for the other person to help them to do that deep inner work that they're meant to do. And if their partner or their friend needs time and space, it's sort of understood, like the other 7 is going to get it, right? Because they also need the same thing and they don't have to explain it. And that can take a lot of pressure and sort of weight off their shoulders. So again, really beautiful connection and helping each other go deeper into, your own, again, psyche can be so powerful. I'm not saying that they're taking up the role of therapist or anything like that. But again, it just can be a really powerful connection. And this is 7 is the most psychic number in numerology. And so there's a deep, deep connection to the spiritual, to the unseen, to even the taboo. And so again, being in a partnership with someone who just totally gets that, instinctively, can just take a lot of weight off your shoulders. And so again, I think it's can be a really beautiful connection with these two numbers coming together. And also something that can also be a point of contention, but can also be very beautiful, is both of these numbers, right? 7 and 7 coming together. The 7 this is a journey also of trust, trusting self, trusting others, trusting the universe. And a lot of the life lessons that come in for the 7 are going to be around trust and learning how to trust, etc. And be vulnerable again, even after being hurt or, something happening that leads to mistrust. And so you get another person who understands that, how that feels and all the things. It can, again, help the other person to become, to learn that lesson more quickly and to be vulnerable more quickly. So it can be really beautiful and they can feel safe in that space. Now, where there would be some points of contention, of course, would be the same thing. There's that need for trust. And if you're in your shadow side and you're mistrustful, again, two people coming together who don't trust can obviously lead to a lot of toxicity real quick. Also, the 7 can, again, for fear of getting hurt or someone hurting them or whatever, they can sabotage themselves or others in order to protect themselves to not get hurt. And that can, of course, create, issues as well. Both tend to be more stubborn. I say both, 7 and 7 tend to be more stubborn, stuck in their ways, can be cynical at times, can also be very logical and cut off from the more spiritual side of themselves or the higher side of themselves, again, when they're in their shadow. And so they can be driven by ego very easily, early on especially, and can just come across as aloof or not understanding or very self-absorbed and self-centric. And so that can be, of course, very difficult in a connection where there needs to be that communication and reciprocity and all those things. So it can be very frustrating at times. The other thing is that, the 7, of course, needs alone time, and where that can be really beautiful, again, both understanding each other, but it can also lead to both sort of being very reclusive and shut off from the rest of the world. And so kind of like lose each other within their connection, like lose themselves within one another and kind of shut out the outside world. And so that can, of course, lead to issues down the road. And also with the 7s, this is a lifetime as well for really like mastering your emotions and emotional maturity. And so there's a lot of charged energy that they have to work with in this lifetime. And we all do, but they really do. And so managing those emotions, being able to express themselves and in a healthy way, etc. So again, if you get 2 7s that are in their lower octave, there can be a lot of aggressiveness, fighting, holding a grudge, vindictiveness, manipulation, etc. And obviously that can't be too fun. But overall, I think this is actually a really beautiful connection. The 7 and the 8, I think this could be a really powerful dynamic, a really beautiful connection when both are in their higher octave, for sure, because you would have the 8, though it governs the material world, right, and is very much focused in this lifetime on money, status, power, influence, etc. There's this side of the 8 that is very spiritual. Like it's meant to be very much tied to its spirituality in order to help that person lift themselves up from the valleys that they will, of course, walk through. Because the lifetime of the 8 is about taking risks, and there's going to be peaks and valleys throughout those taking of risks. And so they need to have some sense of spirituality, some sense of a connection to their higher self in order to continue to get up, try again, pick themselves up, and to not get sort of sucked into victim mentality or frustration. And the 7 can really open the 8 up to that, because the 7 is a very spiritual energy. It's a very much, the veil is thin. It's very connected to the unseen. And so it can actually, in a connection, the 7 can help the 8 to really connect to that side of themselves. And that can be incredibly powerful for the 8. And for the 7, this is a lifetime of having lessons around trust and learning to trust self, trust others, trust the universe. And it's interesting because if you get someone who's an 8 that's in their higher octave, they have learned to trust themselves and others and the universe, and they need to, because they have to be able to take risks and then move through the consequences of those risks, which are usually highs and lows, right? Peaks and valleys, gains and losses. And so throughout their journey, they learn to trust. It's a necessity for survival, let's say. And so they can actually really help the 7 in that process and help them to overcome the fears of trusting self, others, and the universe. So it can be a really beautiful sort of coming together of these two energies. Now, where there might be some points of contention would be, when the 7 is in its lower octave, this is an energy that can be distrustful. It can sort of sabotage themselves or others or the connection in order to keep from getting hurt, right? Like, in other words, they want to break the connection before the connection breaks them, so to speak. They can be very stubborn, stuck in their ways, can be cynical, can be stuck in victim mentality, can really have a really hard time expressing their emotions and managing their emotions. And that can obviously lead to some difficulties within the connection. Now, with the 8 energy, when it's in its lower vibration, it can be very domineering. It can be very controlling, manipulative, need to kind of have the final say. It can be very stubborn as well. So you get these two people who could be very stubborn, butting heads. That could be very difficult. The 8 can come across as sort of like needing to lead. And the 7 is sort of a softer energy. It's more feminine. So it could feel like it needs to it could be okay with following, right? But it could lose itself within the connection of the 8. And the 8 could kind of take control of that type thing. And so it can create some power dynamics that can be really unhealthy without obviously those kind of working through things. Also with the 7, if it feels like it's not in a safe environment to express itself, it can go within and kind of shut down, and then there's no communication. With the 8, it can be, if it's in its lower octave, a little bit more sort of, a little more domineering, and so can kind of want to take charge of that connection. And it can just be kind of it can be a difficult connection when it's in their lower octave, because there's definitely power plays, and the 7 would likely get their feelings hurt or be overly sensitive, and the 8 would sort of maybe take advantage of that. And that can definitely happen when both are in their lower octaves. And then it can just kind of lead to disintegration of that connection. So it can be very difficult. Also, not always, but sometimes the 7, because it is so sort of focused on self-discovery in this lifetime, and that is the focus in this lifetime. And the 8 is very ambitious. It's more outward driven. So it's more about achieving their goals and reaching success and etc. And where that can actually be a beautiful balance in a healthy connection, where there's, an unhealthy connection, it can, the 8 can get frustrated by the 7 for not having stronger goals and achievements and all those things and wanting that success. And the 7 can be frustrated with the 8 for constantly being so overly ambitious and not sort of appearing to not do the sort of the inner work and kind of be more connected with self. So again, some strong points of contention within this connection, but if you can get to the higher octaves, it can actually be very beautiful. The 7 and the 9, this is a beautiful connection, or it can be, again, in the higher octave, because both the 7 and the 9 are very spiritual just by nature. The veil is thin. There's a deep connection to their higher self, to the universe, to God, whatever you want to, whatever you subscribe to. There's just that deeper sense of purpose, deeper purpose, greater purpose for both the 7 and the 9, just because, again, of that sort of the veil being thinner. And so when they come together, it can be highly spiritual, very, very like connecting at like a soul level. It can be very soulful, this connection. Two sort of old souls kind of coming together and connecting and bringing the unseen into the seen can be very, very beautiful, very compassionate, very understanding. Both kind of are softer, more feminine energies, so more like sort of receptive, receptive to the other person's needs, that sort of thing. They're both kind of, again, sort of those softer energies. So there's not necessarily, again, if they're both in their higher octaves, this like need for dominance or control or whatnot. It's would be a very softer kind of connection, and really, really supportive and compassionate and beautiful, also autonomous, right? Both understanding that the other person needs their space and needs to be, that they have sort of have to fulfill their mission in life. Which is interesting because, and this actually would complement each other very well, the nine's mission in life is more outward driven, right? It's more about the humanitarian, helping others, supporting others, uplifting others, inspiring others, that sort of thing. The 7, this is a lifetime of greater self-discovery. It's about coming back to self, going within. It's a very much like self-focused lifetime. And that is the purpose. It's growth through greater understanding of self, expansion through greater understanding of self. And so it's actually a really beautiful dynamic when you think about it. And so again, these two coming together can help the other out when it comes to expressing themselves, expressing their gifts, etc. The 7 can help the 9 come back to self, go within, do that self-discovery work. And the 9 can help the 7 to once it figures out its gifts and its medicine and all those things, it can help the 7 to share those gifts and integrate into the external world in a more profound way. So again, very beautiful. Points of contention can be extreme because, we have the 7 who is meant to be learning to trust in this lifetime. So if you have a 7 who is in its lower octave and not trusting, then, not trusting your partner can obviously wreak havoc on that connection. The 9 can tend to be more of the martyr and wanting to save the world type of thing and wanting to save their partner and do everything for their partner so they don't have to do it for themselves. And that can be very disempowering. And so, those dynamics can definitely kind of chip away at that connection in the long run. Both can have, can be stubborn, can fall into cynicism and kind of, be more cynical in their approach and also how they view the world and view others. And so, again, if you get two people who are cynical and kind of mistrusting of the other person, it just creates a dynamic for emotions to fly and hurt feelings and vindictiveness and all those things. Also, both are typically very emotive, right? The 7 is meant to manage their emotions, master their emotions in this lifetime. And so until they do that, there can be a lot of like outbursts and or going within and withdrawing and not expressing themselves. And so kind of shutting off communication. And so it can be, kind of going into avoidance, and that can create obviously issues in the long run as well. So again, just like the normal kind of typical things when we're in our lower expressions that they would have to work through. And both kind of asking for support and receiving support, being vulnerable. If you're in your sort of shadow side or the other person is, it can be hard to be vulnerable. So yeah, it's not so much about are these two compatible? It's about how far are they on their own evolution and journey, and when they come together, because that's going to determine sort of how the relationship plays out, and whether it works or not. Life path 8 with life path 8. So I always say that two life paths of the same coming together can be difficult. It's probably one of the more challenging connections to have, especially romantically. But when you can get to the higher octave of this connection and of your life path, then it can actually be a really, beautiful connection, and it can be like the powerhouse connection of numerology. So sort of like that power couple. The 8 is a very ambitious energy. It's meant to be the business-minded leader in this lifetime. It's meant to pull from its inner strength, to take risks, to maneuver the highs and lows and the consequences of taking those risks in order to recognize what's working and remove that, and then build on what does work. But there can be a lot of kind of moving through lack of confidence, fear, self-doubt, the need for control and perfectionism and all of those things. With this energy. But because it's such an ambitious energy, and it usually has strong goals that it's moving towards, and needs to be able to take the risks in order to achieve those goals, having a partner or some kind of connection that is also an 8 would understand that and actually could really bring the sort of be your best cheerleader and kind of push you to continue to take the risks and continue to move through the lows to get to those highs. And probably just because the way the life works, though there's going to be times when both of you would be in those lows after taking risks, there will be times where, the other person will be in a high and you'll be in a low, and they'll be able to help you come out of that and vice versa. And so it actually can create a beautiful dynamic of reciprocity and really pushing each other and helping each other and supporting one another to find the confidence, find the motivation to, take the risks and pursue those goals in life, because that is such the substantial piece of the 8. So these two coming together, what you could build together is just, it's building an empire. It's building some kind of something very significant. So as a business relationship, this could be very profound, like very significant. As a romantic relationship, this could also be very empowering for both people in a lot of ways, because a lot of people are not going to understand the journey of the 8 like an 8 would understand the journey of the 8. And so it can be very powerful in that sense. That's from the higher octave. But in the lower octaves of this energy is where there's very strong points of contention. And I do feel like double 8s kind of coming together can be I think it's one of the harder connections, to be honest, because, the 8 is meant to be very focused, very ambitious in this lifetime. And there needs to be some level of control, but also knowing when to surrender all of those things. But when it's in its shadow, it can be very controlling, very perfectionist, very almost domineering, and can also be, manipulative at times, obsessive, sort of, jealous, all of those things, very insecure, kind of lashing out about those insecurities onto the other person. Can be detached from their spiritual self and kind of more driven by their ego and be more self-absorbed. And again, these sound awful, but it's not shaming the 8. It's just the lower octave of the 8. And so it's part of the journey that the 8 has to move through. So if you get 2 8s coming together who are in those shadows, right, where they're just power hungry and again, sort of lacking that integrity, very self-serving, not being ethical, very judgmental, authoritarian type thing, that can be obviously very toxic in a relationship or in a connection. Even like 2 business people coming together who have 8 energy, if they're in their lower energy, it's going to end in like a significant clash of the titans, let's say. So it can be, it could also turn to be, one of those connections that could turn violent, could turn extreme, because it's in astrology, the 8 energy is sort of like Pluto energy. And so, Pluto, it can be about evolution and growth and expansion and beautiful things, but it can also be destructive and very, again, manipulative and obsessive and controlling and all those things. So again, if you have 2 people in their lower octaves of the 8, there's going to be a lot of fireworks and not in necessarily the healthiest kind of fireworks. So it can be very, very daunting and very difficult to overcome, because both 8s would want to be sort of in the spotlight, would want to have it be about them and sort of be in control of the situation. And that just doesn't work in like a connection. So that can be difficult. And also 8s can be stubborn. And so, you have 2 stubborn people coming together, clashing heads, that can not end well. Not saying it can't be a beautiful connection, because it absolutely can, especially if you can get to the higher octaves of that 8 energy. If you have 2 people coming together that are 8s that are in their higher octave, who are like, approaching that connection in a healthy way, again, power couple. These are people who can just change the world in such a magnificent, powerful way. And likely they will have the resources to do that from what they have created and what they have built. But getting to that point can be incredibly difficult if it's not 2 8s coming together who have already done the work and who are already sort of in that higher octave of their own energy. Otherwise, it can be very destructive and very difficult connection in the lower octaves. Life Path 8 and Life Path 9 coming together. This can be really beautiful because you have this sort of beautiful balance of support and compassion and kind of nurturing, but then also you have that ambition, taking risks, powerhouse energy of the 8. So, these two coming together in their higher octaves can be very supportive of one another and can really kind of help the other. So the 9 can help the 8 to infuse greater integrity and sort of more ethical behavior in their work and how they show up in the world and sort of what their motivations are. And just day to day, right? It can help the 8 to tap into its greater sense of spirituality, its greater sense of self, that would open the channel to that spiritual side of the 8, which the 8 needs in this lifetime in order to overcome some of those more difficult challenges of taking risks and it not working out, right? So they have to be able to pull themselves back up, try again. And that takes a lot of sort of not only faith in something bigger, but faith in self. And the 9 can help the 8 to get there. Also, the 8 can help the 9 to be more empowered and set healthy standards and, speak up for themselves and ask for assistance when they need it and take the initiative to go after their goals and that sort of thing. So it really becomes this actually really beautiful merging of support, again, compassion, understanding, spirituality, joining with that powerhouse energy of taking risks, being ambitious, being a leader, going after your biggest hopes and dreams, etc. So very supportive of each other when it comes to the higher octave. Also, again, with the 8 needing to take constant risks and putting itself out there and again, moving through the consequences of taking those risks, it can fall into lack of confidence, feeling unworthy, losing faith in itself, that sort of thing. But the 9 can really help the 8 to feel supported, to recognize the reality of the situation and to move beyond that frustration or that self-doubt, and really connect the 8 back to themselves, which can be incredibly beautiful. Now, points of contention with this connection would be, the 9 tends to be a little bit more of a sensitive energy. It's very, it can be very serious because there is a greater focus in this lifetime to step into a purpose greater than self. And that can feel very daunting and very big. Whereas the 8 is more sort of focused on, I don't want to say self, but it's more about like achievement of their goals and their aspirations and that sort of thing. And though the 8 is meant to circulate that energy, right? The focus does not initiate being focused on others type of thing. Whereas the 9, the focus is on others. So if you get two of these people in their shadows, the 9 could see the 8 as being very selfish and self-motivated and sort of lacking that integrity, which could be very possible as the 8 moves through its own journey, figuring that out. And the 8 could see the 9 as sort of lacking that ambition, lacking that drive, lacking that need for success or whatever it may be. And so there can kind of be that judgment from both sides and can kind of deteriorate the connection if you're not careful. Also, again, the 9 tends to be a little bit more sensitive. The 8 can be a little bit more dominant. And so if there's not that open communication, the 9 can feel sort of bulldozed by the 8, and the 8 can see the 9 as sort of stuck in victim mentality or too sensitive, right? And so again, it's definitely going to take learning each other's love languages with this connection, and finding compromise and showing up in ways that are healthy for both and are all involved. When you can do that, again, this can be such a beautifully profound connection, like a very deep soul connection in a lot of ways. But getting there can be difficult. And it would be easy for the 8 to dominate and control and manipulate the 9 in this situation. And then that would, of course, create a lot of resistance and resentment and all those things from the 9 to the 8. And so it can kind of create those dynamics. So yeah, just a lot of conversations and communication would be very much needed in this connection. I do think it's one of the more difficult connections, to be honest. But once you can kind of overcome the hurdles, and once both people kind of step into the higher octaves of their own expression, it can actually be very, very beautiful, very, very powerful and beautiful. Life Path 9 with Life Path 9. So this is one of those connections similar to the 7 where I feel like, usually I say two life paths coming together that are the same are probably the most difficult connections. But I think with a 9, this could be one of those connections where that's not necessarily the case. I do actually think that you all, if you're in your higher octaves, this can be such a powerful, beautiful connection. And I say that because, the journey of the 9 in this lifetime is very difficult. It's one of sort of bearing a cross, to be, not to bring religion into it, but it's that kind of energy. It really is. It's very much, there's a lot of loss usually in the journey of the 9. There's a lot of, just injustices that you have to sort of either move through or witness. A lot of just difficulty in this lifetime. It's a very harrowing lifetime to be a 9. And so 2 9s coming together could actually really support each other in a way that I think other life paths would have a difficult time supporting the 9, in that they don't even have to sort of express it with words. They just get it. They understand sort of what you've been through or what you're moving through, especially when it comes to that loss and the injustices and the difficulties. But also they understand the greater purpose that the 9 is being asked to step into in this lifetime, and the pressure that's involved with that, and the sort of serious nature that can instill. And so again, it's sort of like understanding your partner without having to say anything. And that can be really powerful. And so I do think with 2 9s coming together, it can be just a very incredible connection. It's interesting. I would be curious if there's any 9s that are with another 9 romantically, or I mean, probably as friends and stuff like that. But I would be very curious about romantically. And I say that because the way the universe works, a lot of times the universe is sort of set up, not punitive, but, to where we get we gain the most wisdom in this lifetime. And if we're with someone who it's too easy, there's no lessons there. And so I can almost see like the universe kind of keeping 9s from 9s, if that makes sense. Not being punitive, but because it is such a harrowing journey, it's like the 9 has to move through that journey, sometimes alone in a lot of ways. Not saying it can't happen, and I'm sure it does happen, that 9s come together. But yeah, I think it's a beautiful connection when 2 9s come together, especially when you're in your higher octave. And you would have to be in your higher octave for it to work, to be honest. When you're both in your lower octave, or one is in their lower octave or in the shadow side of the 9, that's where this becomes a very difficult connection. Because again, in the lower octave, the 9s can be very judgmental, very bitter, very cynical, very obsessive about money and material gains. They can be stuck in victim mentality or martyrdom. They can have a hard time sort of admitting that something is their fault and taking responsibility and accountability for that. They can have a hard time forgiving. They can hold grudges. 9s and 4s can hold grudges like nobody's business. They can be controlling and sort of self-centered, and where it's always got to be about them. And again, this is in the shadow side, and these are just things that the 9 has to move through within itself in order to get to that higher octave. And so when 2 9s come together who are in those depths of their shadows, it can actually be a very toxic, very hurtful, very, just very not aggressive, but just, it can be a very painful connection, to be honest, and not healthy in a lot of ways. And also the 9 can tend to be enablers of others. So sort of, wanting to do it for the other person. And that can be very disempowering to the other person. And it can also keep the other person stuck in their journey. And so, there can definitely be that emotional immaturity that can kind of come up, and that can lead to some kind of greater abuse even. So in its lower octave, again, 2 9s coming together can be a sort of a clash of the titans in a very toxic way. The spiritual titans in a very toxic way. So it can be very difficult to get to the higher octaves together. in this connection. I'm not saying it's not possible. It absolutely is. But it could definitely be very difficult in a lot of ways. And this is interesting too, because two nines coming together who have had toxic experiences with one another, if they part ways, it's almost like a lesson within itself, an opportunity for forgiveness, for releasing the grudge, for releasing, for moving through it in a healthier way. So, in turn, it would probably turn into some kind of life lesson there as well. But anyway, two nines coming together when they're in their higher octaves, beautiful. I think it's one of the most like old souls coming together and kind of supporting each other in that greater mission in life, greater purpose in life, something bigger than self. And it can be incredibly beautiful. But in that lower octave, it can be very challenging, very, very challenging. And it would require a tremendous amount of work and effort, conversation, and creating that safe space for each other to be able to express themselves, their needs, without trying to fix the other person, dominate the other person, etc. So, ultimately it could be a great life lesson. But if you can get to the higher octave of this connection, yeah, phenomenal, beautiful.